Save the Princess is perhaps the most well-known goal in video games. Among many others, one of its strengths is that it doesn't really require any extra explanation. Evil monster kidnapped a young woman? Of course you go save her. That's simply what you do. Even for people who don't play video games, tales of knightly valor speak for themselves, being part of an impossible number of myths and stories. Some early games are almost defined by their choice to reject this structure, such as in Metroid, where you play as the female character, or Dragon Quest II, where you save a princess, but that's kind of the start of your journey, not the end of it. One series, though, has chosen again and again to embrace the damsel in distress formula, while also insisting on being just a little more complicated than that. Today, I'm going to talk about 3 games in particular from the Legend of Zelda franchise that heavily feature themes of failure and regret, alongside the ordinary princess-saving escapades. The first entry to mention is the 1998 N64 release, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. The immediately obvious contrast between this game and older Zelda titles is the state of the world at the beginning of the story. It's strikingly bright. Happy, even. You wake up from your premonition, which was admittedly pretty dark, to a village of sparkling lights and fairies and happy forest dwellers. Leaving that village would have you greet a big sunny field with an uplifting overture, and then on to a festive castle town, or a cozy cave, or a land of cascading waterfalls. All of these places have problems, of course. It's still a Zelda game, so there has to be something for Link to do. But overall, this world stands in stark contrast to something like the immediate hostility of the original game, or the grim discovery of your dead uncle in A Link to the Past. It's so cheery, in fact, that if you'd played those earlier Zelda games, you would probably be suspicious of a world that's doing so well. As a kid I had not, so I went about my business, not realizing that something was off. The biggest early shocker is Zelda fleeing from Ganon at the end of the child section. It's kind of jarring, because something bad happened right when you were supposed to have triumphed. Link gathered the treasures just like he was told, and Zelda is being pursued in the middle of the night by the evil wizard anyway. What the hell? And then, of course, it's all downhill from there. You continue to follow instructions and go get your magic sword, which will surely let you right the wrongs of the world and save the princess. Except it doesn't. When you pull the sword out, you're transported to the future, and everything is so much worse. The thriving town is now full of zombies. All the friends we made as a child are either being held captive or missing. The evil farmhand has swindled the ranch from the kindly Talon. Instead of some derpy 2-legged lizard, the Gorons are being terrorized by a friggin' dragon. Instead of a giant mighty tree protecting the forest, it's just a little sapling. Compared to the beginning of OOT, this world much more resembles what you start with in those earlier Zelda games. The key difference, though, is that this world is your fault. Link was the chosen hero of time, and the whole world went to crap because instead of fighting Ganondorf, he essentially spent 7 years in a coma. He was simply too weak to be the hero the world needed when it needed him. What's worse, it was the very act of pulling out the sword that allowed Ganondorf to take over the world in the first place. Link isn't exactly the most verbose character, so this feeling of failure and guilt is built through forcing the player to go out and see the world instead of through some sappy monologue. The second half of the game has adult Link revisit many of the same places you just played through, and you see with your own eyes how badly the world fared without you. The contrast of the idyllic Hyrule you inherited versus the post-apocalyptic one you helped create builds a feeling of regret and responsibility that wouldn't exist if the world had sucked from the beginning. The uneasy feeling that this contrast creates is the key difference between Ocarina of Time and other video games. Mario always charges ahead futilely, over and over, but the game never makes you feel like you've screwed up. It's not his fault that the princess is in another castle, that's just the way it is and he needs to keep trying. It's never implied that if he'd been faster or stronger, then he might have rescued her in time. The idea of blame resting on the hero is basically absent from other Nintendo games at the time, whether you look at Star Fox or Metroid or what have you. Link falling short of the hero he was supposed to be is a unique story of personal failure within those Nintendo IPs. I would argue that this theme persists even into how the game ends. Hyrule is broken so badly that killing Ganondorf and freeing Zelda simply isn't good enough. Link and Zelda have to actually turn back time and prevent Ganondorf from obtaining the Triforce at all. If only I could go back in time and do things differently, is perhaps the most regret-laden sentence a person can utter, and that's essentially the note the game ends on. The next game is an interesting one, because it's a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time. Majora's Mask is a weird Zelda game for a whole bunch of reasons, including not actually featuring Princess Zelda, not taking place in Hyrule, not acquiring the Master Sword, etc. However, unlike other games that share these traits, like Link's Awakening or Oracle of Seasons, Majora's Mask doesn't take place in some unrelated far-off realm. Instead, it takes place in Termina, which is a twisted mirror image of the Hyrule from the last game. Basically, all of the same characters appear, just with different names, all the same races and many of the same zones exist, and even the music is similar, but not quite the same. A fun note here is that the Termina Field theme from Majora's Mask contains the melody from the classic Hyrule Overworld theme, while the track Hyrule Field from Ocarina of Time does not. This is an early hint for longtime fans that Majora's Mask is almost the world you know, but it isn't quite right. Anyway, back to the point of this video. In the same way that Termina is a warped version of Hyrule, the theme of regret in this game is inverted as well. In Majora's Mask, Link doesn't really have anything to feel bad about. He's on a quest to find Navi, but it's never implied that Navi ran away because of something that he did wrong. In this game, the regret is instead focused on all the people around Link instead of on himself. One of the primary ways to interact with people in Majora's Mask is to play the Song of Healing, a melody that distills all of their sorrow into a physical form. As a kid, I didn't realize how creepy the masks are by their very nature in this game, but geez, that's pretty heavy. Anyway, whether it be a hero who died trying to help his people, or a guitarist sticking up for his girlfriend, or a dancer who never found proper disciples, the Song of Healing cleanses their soul and lets their spirits pass on. Importantly, in each case, the duty falls to Link to finish what those individuals started. It isn't just about soothing someone who's suffering. Each instance also requires you to fix whatever they screwed up while alive. This makes clear that we aren't just clearing up any generic pain, but specifically resolving their regrets. After Link's growth from saving the world in Ocarina of Time, he is no longer a figure of failure atoning for himself, and instead goes around cleaning up the messes of others. He's like some sort of regret bodhisattva, having returned to the present day in order to guide those who aren't as far along in their personal journeys. The souls you help with the Song of Healing are the most obvious regretful figures, but they're far from the only ones. A butler who lost his son, an actor who won't get to see the show he came for, a sister who worries she can't take care of a farm by herself, and a pair of lovers separated by a cruel magic trick. Once you think about the game through this lens, it's staggering how many of the game's side quests are devoted to aiding people who regret that something in their life has gone wrong. In a weird way, the whole game is about reconciling people after their friendships turned sour based on misunderstandings and overreactions. Link isn't the regretful figure anymore, but the whole game is smothered with the feel of it in a way that wasn't really the case for Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask being thematically connected makes sense. Majora's Mask is a direct sequel, picking up immediately where OOT left off. It wasn't until I made this video that I realized how consistently The Legend of Zelda creates pairs of games featuring the same iteration of Link, and so it would be pretty fitting to choose a theme for the first game, build on it in the second, and then move on to something else for the next pair. What makes the theme of regret kinda weird though is how the series chose to come back to it many years later. Neither the whimsical Toon Link games like Wind Waker, nor the dark and gritty Twilight Princess have it much at all, but failure and guilt came back with a vengeance in the 2017 release, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. The very first thing you experience in this game is Zelda telling you you've been asleep for 100 years. If that doesn't set off alarm bells, I don't know what will. Clearly Link has been MIA while something important was going down. As soon as you leave the cave, you're likely to run into a bearded gentleman, who immediately refers to himself as an old fool. Okay, so something's gone astray in this guy's life as well. Which brings us to the theme of regret in Breath of the Wild. In this game, everyone is upset with themselves and how things have gone wrong. Let's start with Link. Unlike Ocarina of Time, the player hasn't experienced the pre-apocalypse world here, so you don't immediately feel responsible for what's happened. Sure, everyone tells you that there was a battle where you should have played a role, but somehow instead wound up taking the world's most serious nap, but without having seen the context, it kind of just rolls off. This is where the plot element of Link's amnesia becomes relevant. Link, along with the player, gradually uncovers his lost memories, and puts together the story of how Hyrule fell. We watch somberly as past Link tries his best, but comes up incredibly short. As you see how badly you failed to protect both Hyrule and Zelda, it becomes clear that all of those accusations were on point. You did fail, and a lot of people died because you weren't good enough. This ever-building awareness of Link's utter defeat makes the personal regret in this game a slow burn, as opposed to the sledgehammer of it in Ocarina. Breath of the Wild is a much longer game, so it makes sense that they'd want to gradually feed themes like this to you instead of dumping it all at once. What really stuck out to me recently about this game, though, is how most of the other characters are defined by their regrets as well. After forcing you through the tutorial, the old man on the mountain reveals himself to be the king of Hyrule. This man has been dead for 100 years, and his spirit stuck around solely to one day help make things right. That's about as much regret as one person can possibly feel. As you adventure around and meet people, a key difference from Ocarina of Time becomes apparent. In Ocarina, people are understandably glum, but they don't really take that out on you. No one knows that Link was the hero of time, so they don't blame him for catching some Z's while the world burned. Breath of the Wild, though, is a totally different story. At best, people are puzzled over where you were for the last century, and at worst, they're deeply resentful. Tangled up in that resentment, at least in a few places, is a sense that they shouldn't have gotten mixed up with Zelda and Link in the first place. One cool thing about Breath of the Wild is that each faction contributing one of the champions means that each of them has some skin in the game. When Ganon took over, he didn't just ruin things in general. Each of these groups lost their greatest hero. More than one person wishes they'd left the champions out to dry, and possibly have kept Lady Mipha alive. Speaking of the champions, they're one of the more tangible sources of regret in this game. Like the king, each has stuck around to help Link fix things as a spirit despite being dead for a long, long time. It often remains unsaid, but the reality is that on that fateful day, each of them failed as well. We'll never know if things would have gone differently if one or two of the champions had held on to their divine beast, but the hypothetical is irrelevant. They were chosen as elite warriors, and each of them fell, the same as Link did. We're specifically made aware of this in the boss fight at the end of the Divine Beasts, where each champion remarks, "Yes, that was the thing that killed me back then." None of these individuals would feel good about letting the kingdom down, and would certainly all regret needing Link to fix things for them. The last figure I want to talk about is probably the most remorse-ridden of them all, but is also the most complicated about it. Almost every one of Princess Zelda's actions is guided by her guilt, although that isn't immediately obvious. One of the unique things about Zelda is that she's the only one who had something to feel bad about before the real trouble even began. The memories in Breath of the Wild can be found in any order, but simply by virtue of where they are, certain ones are more likely to be found by the player early in the game. One in particular is especially easy to find, and also likely to be the one most surprising to people who see it. We find Zelda and Link adventuring together and really not getting along very well. She snaps at Link, wondering if he even knows how to use the Master Sword properly. Well, excuse me, Princess, but that's Link's responsibility, not yours. In these chronologically early memories, it's not really clear what's eating Zelda, just that she's kind of being a jerk. We can see her pestering the champions, or researching the shrines, or checking in on the guardians, but as her father reminds us, the one thing she isn't doing is her actual job, of contacting the goddess Hylia. These memories are the ones that let us see who Zelda really is. She desperately wants to help her people, but no amount of praying lets her hear the divine voice of Hylia. So what else is she supposed to do? She spends her time tangibly beefing up Hyrule's security, but the whole time it's gnawing at her that she isn't doing the one thing that she alone must achieve. These feelings are horribly magnified on the day of Ganon's attack, because it's the worst possible scenario. She still can't hear the goddess, and Ganon turns her precious guardians and divine beasts against her. Suddenly, she seems a lot like the Link from Ocarina of Time. It's one thing to not be up to your duty, but quite another for your efforts to have actively aided the enemy. Awakening the guardians and divine beasts was actually worse than if she'd just done nothing at all, and this knowledge is devastating to her. She probably wouldn't have gone on at all if not for Link fighting to the bitter end. Her feelings for Link awaken her to Hylia's power, but even in this moment of triumph, we have a new source of regret to beat her over the head with. Link protected her, but nearly died in the process, his sacred sword cracked and rusted and useless. Link got hurt because Zelda didn't manifest her strength quickly enough, and she sees that as a personal failure. The last memory has Link in the Shrine of Resurrection, the Master Sword returned to its grove, and Zelda taking on Ganon alone. She sees the world that she helped burn to the ground, and knows that she's the only one left who can protect it. The next 100 years can't have been pleasant for her, but that is one serious act of penance. It's important to note here how sympathetic the game is to Zelda's plight. One thing that is never explicitly made clear is whether or not all of her praying was simply a waste of time as she barked up the wrong tree. Mipha hints that magical power doesn't come from piety, and instead springs from the emotions she feels about someone that she cares about. Zelda's magic seems to work the same way, absolutely refusing to show itself until her dearest companion is in mortal danger. Furthermore, Zelda spends her time praying at the shrines of courage, power, and wisdom, and specifically mentions the old gods, including Lanayru. If you're a Zelda lore junkie, you might think that that is a really odd thing to do, because the old gods aren't actually where Zelda draws her power from. Rather, she gets her strength from the younger goddess Hylia, and this is reinforced by her finally hearing the voice from the Master Sword, an artifact made by Hylia rather than by the earlier trio. Part of Zelda's failures might be from simply not engaging with her latent power in the right way. The game shows its sympathy for her futile and misguided quest with a beautiful bit of directing in the 12th memory, Father and Daughter. The King of Hyrule is firm to the point of callousness in chastising Zelda, which makes sense but isn't going to score him any points with the player. Then, in a surprisingly nuanced shot, Zelda stands her ground, albeit quietly. She clearly fears her father and her subjects, and her confidence is understandably shot, but she still shows the strength of her character in refusing to be bullied when she knows she's been trying her hardest. The next cut reinforces both parts of this dynamic, showing Zelda's angrily clenched fist, but also showing Link. He's kneeling, his eyes glued to the floor. Even Zelda's personal knight and closest friend doesn't dare stand up to the king for her. The game really wants you to know how desperate and isolated Zelda is, even in her most painful and guilt-wracked moments. Nintendo has kind of earned a reputation of valuing gameplay and surface-level aesthetics over nuanced storytelling, but these brief moments show that Breath of the Wild is really trying to break that mold. And that's everything I can think of. I've played most Zelda games at least once, but it's possible there's something I missed. I enjoyed making this video because it can be a bit tough to mine games for thematic meaning when the plots are thin and the main character doesn't talk, but this time it really felt like it came together. If you like this sort of long-form analysis content, I'd love it if you could subscribe to my channel. It helps me to grow and makes sure you see all my new stuff as it comes out. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.